I never thought I'd see my own brother walk into our mother's funeral lawyer's office with his mistress on his arm, both of them practically glowing with greed. But there they were, Bob with that smug smile I'd grown to hate, and Sandra clinging to him like he was her golden ticket to Easy Street. They had no idea that our mother, Eleanor Thompson, had been watching them both very carefully in her final years, and what she had planned for that will reading would wipe those greedy grins right off their faces. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people become aware of the reality of elder abuse. Now let me tell you what really happened. My name is Margaret Thompson, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 68 years old, and until 3 weeks ago, I was spending every single day caring for my 94-year-old mother, Eleanor, while my younger brother Bob was off living his best life with his 45-year-old girlfriend Sandra. I was the one changing mother's medications, driving her to doctor appointments, and holding her hand through the long, frightening nights when the pain got too bad for her to sleep. Don't get me wrong, I didn't mind caring for Mother. She raised me and Bob as a single parent after our father died when I was 12, and she deserved every ounce of love and attention I could give her. But it stung, more than I care to admit, that Bob couldn't be bothered to visit more than once every few months, and even then, he'd spend most of the time checking his phone or making excuses about why he couldn't stay long. The day Mother passed away peacefully in her sleep, I was the one holding her hand. Bob didn't even make it to the hospital in time, because he was on some romantic weekend getaway with Sandra in the Bahamas. When he finally showed up to the funeral home 2 days later, Sandra was draped all over him like an expensive scarf, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "Oh, Maggie," Sandra had cooed at me with that fake sympathy voice she'd perfected. "I'm so sorry for your loss. Eleanor was such an interesting woman." Interesting. That's what she called my mother, a woman who had raised 2 children alone, built a successful small business, and saved every penny to ensure her family would be taken care of after she was gone. But I bit my tongue because it was Mother's funeral and she would have wanted me to keep the peace. The funeral was beautiful, though smaller than it should have been. Mother had outlived most of her friends, and Bob hadn't bothered to reach out to the extended family to let them know about the service. It was mostly neighbors, people from Mother's church, and a few former colleagues from the elementary school where she'd worked as a secretary for 30 years before starting her own small accounting business. After the service, as people were offering their condolences, I overheard Sandra whispering to Bob near the back of the church. "When do we find out about the will?" she was saying, not even trying to look grief-stricken anymore. "I mean, she had that big house and the business money, plus all those investments you told me about. We should probably meet with the lawyer this week." "Don't worry, baby," Bob replied, and I could hear the confidence in his voice even from across the room. Mother always said the house would be split between Maggie and me. And with all the money she saved up over the years, we're looking at a pretty comfortable future. My hands trembled as I folded the program from Mother's service. They were already counting money that hadn't been distributed yet, making plans for an inheritance they assumed was coming their way. Neither of them had spent a single night at Mother's bedside during her final illness. Neither of them had sacrificed their social lives to make sure she wasn't alone. But somehow, in Bob's mind, he was entitled to exactly the same consideration as the daughter who had devoted the last 5 years of her life to their mother's care. The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, approached me after most of the guests had left. "Mrs. Thompson," he said gently, "I'd like to schedule the reading of your mother's will for next week, if that works for you." "I'll need to contact your brother as well, of course." "Of course," I agreed, though my stomach was already churning with anxiety. "Mr. Henderson, may I ask, did Mother make any changes to her will recently?" His expression was carefully neutral, the way lawyers learn to be when they're holding information that could change everything. "She did make some updates over the past year," he said carefully. "But I'm not at liberty to discuss the details until the formal reading. I will say this, though your mother was a very thoughtful woman who cared deeply about fairness and family responsibility." Something in his tone made me look at him more closely, but his professional mask was firmly in place. "The reading is scheduled for next Tuesday at 10 in the morning," he continued. I've already left a message for your brother. The week that followed was the longest of my life. I spent my days cleaning out Mother's house, going through decades of memories packed away in closets and drawers. I found letters she'd written but never sent, photographs from Bob's and my childhood, and a journal she'd kept during her final year. I didn't read the journal, it felt too private, even now, but its existence told me that Mother had been thinking deeply about many things as her time grew short. Bob called me twice during that week, and both conversations followed the same pattern. "Hey, sis," he'd say, his voice artificially casual. "How are you holding up?" We'd chat for a few minutes about funeral arrangements and the house. And then he'd work around to what he really wanted to know. "So, have you heard anything from the lawyer about the will reading? Sandra and I are curious about timing, you know. We've got some financial planning we need to do." Financial planning? As if Mother's death was just another business opportunity to be managed. "It's next Tuesday at 10, I told him during the second call. "Mr. Henderson's office downtown." "Great, great," Bob said, and I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. "Sandra's excited to finally understand more about the family finances. She's got some great ideas about investment opportunities." My blood ran cold. Sandra was making plans for money that might not even be hers to plan with. But I didn't say anything because honestly, I wasn't sure what to expect either. Mother had always been fair to both her children, even when one of them clearly deserved more consideration than the other. The night before the will reading, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times over the past few years when Bob had disappointed Mother. The birthday dinner he'd skipped because Sandra wanted to go to a wine tasting. The Christmas Eve when he'd left early because Sandra didn't like all the old-fashioned family stuff. The hospital visits he'd missed, the doctor appointments he couldn't be bothered to attend, the countless small moments when Mother had needed her son, and he simply hadn't been there. But I also remembered the woman who had raised us both, who had always preached forgiveness and second chances. Surely she wouldn't punish Bob too harshly for his selfishness. Surely she'd want her children to be taken care of equally, regardless of who had been more present in her final years. Tuesday morning dawned gray and rainy, which felt appropriate for the occasion. I dressed carefully in my navy blue suit, the one Mother had always said made me look professional and distinguished. As I drove to Mr. Henderson's office, I tried to prepare myself for whatever was coming. I arrived 15 minutes early, but Bob and Sandra were already there, sitting in the leather chairs in Mr. Henderson's waiting room. Bob was wearing an expensive suit I'd never seen before, and Sandra was dressed like she was going to a cocktail party rather than a legal proceeding. They both looked up when I walked in, and I was struck by how expectant they seemed. Like children on Christmas morning, waiting to unwrap presents. "Maggie!" Sandra jumped up to give me a hug I didn't want. "How are you holding up, sweetie? This must be so hard for you." Her sympathy was as artificial as her eyelashes, but I managed a weak smile. "I'm managing," I said, taking a seat across from them. Bob leaned forward in his chair, his hands clasped together. "I've been thinking, sis. Whatever Mother left us, we should probably coordinate our financial strategies. Sandra has some connections in real estate investment that could really multiply whatever inheritance we're looking at." "Bob," I said quietly, "we don't even know what's in the will yet." "Oh, come on." He laughed, that confident laugh that had always annoyed me. "We both know Mother was a saver. She's probably got more money tucked away than either of us realized. And that house alone has got to be worth at least $400,000 in today's market." Sandra nodded enthusiastically. "I've already had a friend who's a realtor drive by to give me a rough estimate. The neighborhood has really gone upscale in the last few years. We're looking at some serious money here." They had already had the house appraised. They were making plans before they even knew if they were inheriting anything. I felt sick to my stomach, but before I could respond, Mr. Henderson's secretary appeared. "The attorney will see you now," she said. As we filed into his office, I caught sight of Bob and Sandra exchanging a look, a quick, excited glance that confirmed what I already knew. They thought they were about to hit the jackpot. They had no idea that our mother, Eleanor Thompson, had been a much shrewder judge of character than either of them had ever realized. And they were about to find out just how carefully she had been watching them both. Mr. Henderson's office was exactly what you'd expect from a lawyer who'd been practicing for 40 years. Mahogany bookshelves lined with legal volumes, diplomas and certificates covering one wall, and a massive desk that looked like it had witnessed countless family dramas over the decades. The smell of old leather and coffee hung in the air, and everything felt heavy with the weight of important decisions. We settled into the chairs arranged in front of his desk, me in the middle, Bob to my right, and Sandra practically vibrating with excitement in the chair next to him. Mr. Henderson took his time organizing the papers in front of him, and I noticed there were quite a few documents, more than I would have expected for a simple will reading. Before we begin, Mr. Henderson said, looking at each of us over his reading glasses, I want to explain that Mrs. Eleanor Thompson's will is somewhat comprehensive. She spent considerable time over the past 18 months ensuring that her wishes were clearly documented and legally sound. She also left specific instructions about how this reading should proceed. Bob shifted impatiently in his seat. How long is this going to take? I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? Split everything between Maggie and me? Mr. Henderson's expression didn't change, but I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Mr. Thompson, your mother's will is many things, but straightforward is not one of them. She was very deliberate about every provision, and she insisted that certain sections be read in their entirety. With no summarizing or paraphrasing, Sandra leaned forward. Is there some reason she made it so complicated? I mean, she only had 2 children, or Mrs. Mills, Mr. Henderson said, and his tone was noticeably cooler when he addressed Sandra. Mrs. Thompson was quite clear that she wanted her final wishes to be thoroughly understood by all parties. She felt that the reasoning behind her decisions was just as important as the decisions themselves. He opened the first folder and withdrew a document that looked like it was several pages long. Let me begin with the opening statement, which Mrs. Thompson wrote herself. He cleared his throat and began to read. I, Eleanor Marie Thompson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby set forth my final will and testament. To my children, Margaret and Robert, who are listening to these words, I want you to know that every decision I have made has been considered carefully and with great love for you both. However, love does not mean blindness, and fairness does not always mean equality. Bob frowned. What does that mean? Fairness doesn't mean equality. Mr. Henderson held up a hand. Please hold all questions until I've finished each section, Mr. Thompson. Your mother was quite insistent about this. He continued reading. Over the past 5 years, as my health declined and I required increasing care and support, I have had the opportunity to observe the true character of my children. Character, I have learned, is not what a person claims to be, but what they do when they think no one is watching, or when sacrifice is required, or when there is nothing immediate to be gained from kindness. Sandra's confident smile was starting to fade, just a little around the edges. I have watched one of my children rearrange their entire life to ensure my comfort, safety, and dignity. I have watched this same child sacrifice their social life, their freedom, and their own comfort to sit with me through countless doctor appointments, medication adjustments, sleepless nights, and frightening moments when my body was failing me. I felt my eyes filling with tears, but I tried to keep my composure. I have also watched my other child choose different priorities. I have watched him miss birthdays, holidays, and important milestones because other activities seemed more appealing. I have watched him introduce me to a woman who has never shown the slightest genuine interest in getting to know me as a person, but who has asked remarkably detailed questions about my financial situation. Bob's face was turning red. Mother always exaggerated things. I visited plenty of times. Mr. Henderson looked at him sternly. Mr. Thompson, your mother left specific instructions that there were to be no interruptions during the reading. If you continue to interrupt, I'll have to ask you to leave and receive your copy of the will by mail. Bob settled back in his chair, but I could see the muscles in his jaw working. Mr. Henderson continued, I want to be clear that this will is not about punishment. It is about recognition. It is about acknowledging that actions have consequences, and that the love and care we give to our family members should be reflected in how we choose to distribute the fruits of a lifetime of hard work and careful saving. That said, I do not believe in completely disinheriting family members, even those who have disappointed me. Blood is blood, and both of my children will receive something from my estate. However, the distribution will reflect the level of responsibility, maturity, and genuine care each has shown. Sandra reached over and grabbed Bob's hand, and I could see that her knuckles were white with tension. Now, let me address the specific bequests. Mr. Henderson turned to a new page. To my daughter Margaret, who has been my companion, my caregiver, my friend, and my greatest source of comfort in my final years, I leave the following." He paused, and even I held my breath. "The family home at 1247 Oak Street, including all furnishings, personal belongings, and household items contained therein. This house represents not just a financial asset, but a lifetime of memories, and I trust Maggie to preserve those memories with the love and respect they deserve." I gasped despite myself. The house was beautiful, and in the neighborhood where Mother had lived for 40 years, it was probably worth close to $500,000. Additionally, to Margaret, I leave my investment portfolio, managed by Whitman Financial Services, currently valued at approximately $850,000, as well as the proceeds from the sale of my accounting business, held in a separate account at First National Bank, totaling approximately $200,000. The room was dead silent. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Over $1 million plus the house. Mother had been far more successful financially than I'd ever realized. Bob looked like he'd been punched in the stomach. What about me?" Henderson held up his hand again and continued reading. "To my son Robert, I leave the following: the sum of $50,000 from my savings account, to be distributed immediately upon the reading of this will. 50,000. Bob's voice cracked. "That's it." But Mr. Henderson wasn't finished. "However, I recognize that $50,000 may not seem proportionate to Robert's expectations. Therefore, I am also leaving him an additional opportunity." Bob leaned forward, hope flickering back into his eyes. "In a separate account, I have set aside an additional $300,000. This money can be Robert's, but only if he meets the following conditions." Sandra gripped Bob's hand tighter. "First, Robert must spend a minimum of 6 months volunteering at a senior care facility, contributing at least 20 hours per week to the care and comfort of elderly residents. This volunteer work must begin within 60 days of this will reading." Bob's mouth fell open. "Second, Robert must attend family counseling sessions with Margaret, focusing on repairing their relationship and understanding the impact of his choices on his family. These sessions must continue for a minimum of 12 weeks. Third, Robert must write a detailed letter to Margaret, acknowledging the sacrifices she made in caring for our mother, and apologizing for the burden his absence placed on her shoulders. This letter must be sincere and substantial, at least 3 pages handwritten, not typed. And fourth, Robert must end his relationship with Sandra Mills within 30 days of this will reading." The silence that followed was deafening. Sandra dropped Bob's hand like it was on fire. "What?" Sandra's voice was shrill. "She can't do that! She can't control your personal relationships from beyond the grave!" Mr. Henderson looked at her calmly. "Actually, Mrs. Mills, she absolutely can attach conditions to inheritances. It's perfectly legal, and these conditions are quite reasonable compared to some I've seen in my career." Bob looked stunned. "Why? Why would she want me to break up with Sandra?" Mr. Henderson turned back to the will. "Your mother anticipated this question, Mr. Thompson. She wrote, 'I am asking Robert to end his relationship with Sandra Mills because I believe she has been a negative influence on his character and his relationship with his family. I have observed her encouraging Robert to prioritize their social activities over family obligations, and I have heard her make disparaging comments about our family values and traditions. A person who truly loves Robert would encourage him to be a better son and brother, not enable him to neglect his family responsibilities. If Sandra truly cares for Robert, and not just his financial prospects, she will understand that this condition is in his best interest." Sandra stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is insane," she shouted. "Bob, you're not seriously considering this, are you? She's trying to manipulate you even after she's dead." But Bob wasn't looking at Sandra anymore. He was staring at the papers in Mr. Henderson's hands, and I could see the wheels turning in his head. $300,000 was still a substantial sum, even if it wasn't the fortune he'd been expecting. "What happens if I don't meet the conditions?" Bob asked quietly. "Then the $300,000 goes to Margaret as well, Mr. Henderson replied. "Your mother was quite clear about this," she said, and I quote, "If Robert is not willing to do the work necessary to become a better man, then the money should go to the child who has already proven her character." Sandra looked back and forth between Bob and the lawyer, and I could see her realizing that her dreams of easy money were crumbling around her. "Bob," she said, her voice taking on a wheedling tone, "you don't have to do this. We can contest the will. There are lawyers who specialize in this kind of thing." Mr. Henderson shook his head. Mrs. Mills, I can assure you that this will is airtight. Mrs. Thompson consulted with specialists in estate law, and she had a psychological evaluation performed to confirm her mental competency. Any challenge would be expensive and ultimately unsuccessful. Bob was quiet for a long moment, his head in his hands. When he finally looked up, his face was a mixture of anger, confusion, and something that might have been shame. I need to think about this, he said. Of course, Mr. Henderson replied. You have 60 days to begin the volunteer work if you choose to pursue the additional inheritance. But Robert, his voice became gentler, I knew your mother for many years. She wasn't trying to punish you. She was trying to give you a chance to become the man she always believed you could be. As we left the lawyer's office, Sandra was already on her phone, presumably calling someone about challenging the will. Bob walked in stunned silence, and I found myself overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions, grief for my mother, relief that her sacrifices had been recognized, and a strange hope that maybe, just maybe, Bob might actually try to meet her conditions. But as I watched Sandra's face twisted with rage and disappointment, I had a feeling the real drama was just beginning. The parking lot outside Mr. Henderson's office became a battlefield the moment we stepped out of the building. Sandra was pacing back and forth between the cars like a caged animal, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice getting louder with each word. Yes, I understand you specialize in will contests, she was saying to whoever was on the other end. This is exactly the kind of case you handle, right? Undue influence, mental incapacity, that sort of thing. Bob stood frozen beside his car, his keys in his hand, staring at nothing in particular. I wanted to say something to him, but I honestly didn't know where to begin. How do you talk to your brother when you've just inherited over $1 million, and he's been left with conditions that might as well have been a slap in the face? Maggie, he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper, did you know about any of this? No, Bob, I replied honestly. I had no idea Mother had saved so much money, and I certainly didn't know about the conditions she was setting for you. Sandra snapped her phone shut and marched over to us, her face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous, she announced. Bob, we are not letting some dead woman control our lives. I've already found 3 lawyers who handle this exact type of case. We can have this will overturned within 6 months. Sandra, Bob said slowly, you heard what Henderson said. Mother had psychological evaluations, legal consultants. She covered her bases. So what? Sandra's voice was rising to a near shriek. Are you just going to roll over and accept this? She's asking you to dump me, Bob! Your girlfriend of 3 years! She's trying to break us up from beyond the grave. I watched my brother's face as Sandra spoke, and I could see him really looking at her, maybe for the first time. The mask of fake sympathy she'd worn during Mother's funeral was completely gone now, replaced by something ugly and desperate. Maybe, Bob said quietly. We should talk about this at home. Talk about what? Sandra demanded. There's nothing to talk about. Either you fight this insulting will, or you're not the man I thought you were. The way she said it, like an ultimatum, like a threat, made something click in Bob's expression. For just a moment, he looked like the little boy I remembered from our childhood, the one who used to get that same confused, hurt look when the neighborhood bullies would turn on him. Sandra, he said, maybe you should go home. I need some time to think. Time to think? Her laugh was harsh and bitter. Bob, while you're thinking, I'm going to be looking for a new place to live, free, because I am not staying with a man who's too weak to fight for what's rightfully his. What's rightfully his? The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them. Sandra, tell me, what exactly do you think Bob did to earn inheritance from my mother? She whirled around to face me, and the look in her eyes was pure venom. He's her son. That should be enough. Just because you decided to play the martyr and give up your life to be an unpaid nurse doesn't mean you deserve everything. I didn't give up my life, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. I spent time with my mother. I took care of her because I loved her, because that's what families do for each other. Oh, please? Sandra sneered. Don't act like you're some kind of saint. You were probably in her ear the whole time, poisoning her against Bob, making sure you'd inherit everything. Bob looked up sharply. Sandra, that's enough. But Sandra was on a roll now, and all her carefully maintained pretenses were falling away. You know what I think, Maggie? I think you're a pathetic old maid who couldn't find a man of her own. So you latched onto your mother and made her dependent on you so you'd have someone to control. And now you're being rewarded for it while Bob gets treated like a second, Class citizen in his own family? The parking lot went completely silent. Even the traffic on the street seemed to pause. Bob was staring at Sandra like he'd never seen her before, and I felt like I'd been slapped. Sandra, Bob's voice was very quiet, but there was something dangerous in it. I think you need to leave. Now? What? You heard me. Go home. Pack your things. Find somewhere else to stay tonight? Sandra's mouth fell open. You're kicking me out. Over what? Some hurt feelings. Bob. I'm trying to help you here. I'm trying to fight for us? No, Bob said, and he was looking directly at her now, really seeing her. You're fighting for money. Money that isn't even yours. Money that might not even be mine. Of course it's yours. You're her son. And what have I done to earn it? Bob asked, echoing my earlier question. Sandra? Tell me honestly, when was the last time I visited Mother without you complaining about it? When was the last time I spent more than an hour at her house without you calling me to leave? Sandra opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. You know what? Bob continued, his voice getting stronger. I'm starting to remember things. Like how you always had somewhere else to be whenever Mother invited us for Sunday dinner. Like how you convinced me to skip her birthday last year because you'd already bought concert tickets. Like how you spent the entire funeral reception talking about the house's resale value. Bob, I was just being practical. Practical? Bob's voice was rising now. Sandra, my mother died 3 weeks ago, and you haven't said one genuine thing about missing her or being sorry she's gone. Not one. All you've talked about is money. Sandra looked back and forth between Bob and me, and I could see her calculating, trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. Honey, she said. Her voice suddenly soft and pleading. You're upset? You're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. Once we get this will overturned, we can use your inheritance to start that business we talked about. Maybe buy that house in Florida. What business? Bob asked. Sandra, what business? You've never mentioned any business. She fumbled for words. The investment opportunities I told you about. Real estate. Maybe some stock market. You mean the investment opportunities you mentioned for the first time in the lawyer's office an hour ago. Sandra's face was getting redder by the minute. Bob, if you don't fight this will, if you let your sister manipulate you like this, then maybe your mother was right about us. Maybe we don't belong together. It was the wrong thing to say. I could see it in Bob's face the moment the words left her mouth. You know what, Sandra? Bob said, pulling out his car keys. Maybe Mother was right about a lot of things. Sandra stared at him for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was cold as ice. Fine. You want to throw away 3 years together for some money you might not even get. Go ahead, but don't come crawling back to me when you realize what a mistake you're making. She stomped over to her own car, yanked open the door, and paused just long enough to shout back at us. And Maggie, enjoy your blood money. I hope it was worth destroying your brother's happiness. She slammed the car door and peeled out of the parking lot, leaving Bob and me standing there in the sudden quiet. For a long moment, neither of us said anything. Bob was staring at the spot where Sandra's car had been, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't quite read. Bob, I said gently. Are you okay? He laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. Am I okay? Maggie, I just realized that the woman I've been with for 3 years never actually cared about me. She cared about what she thought I could give her. And apparently our mother figured that out a long time ago. We stood there for another moment in the cooling afternoon air. You know what the worst part is? Bob said finally. I think I knew. Deep down, I think I knew Sandra wasn't the person I tried to convince myself she was. But it was easier to ignore it than to admit I'd made such a huge mistake. Bob? No, let me finish, he said, turning to look at me directly. Maggie, I owe you an apology. A big one. Sandra was right about one thing. You did give up your life to take care of Mother. While I was off playing house with a woman who obviously didn't give a damn about our family, you were the one doing the hard work, the real work. I felt tears starting to form in my eyes again. You don't have to. Yes, I do, Bob said firmly. Mother's conditions. They're not really conditions, are they? They're a roadmap. A way for me to become the kind of person I should have been all along. He looked back toward the lawyer's office building. 6 months of volunteer work at a senior care facility, he said thoughtfully. Family counseling, a real apology to you, and breaking up with Sandra. He paused. Well, I guess that last one's already taken care of. Bob, you don't have to meet Mother's conditions for the money. The $50,000 is still. It's not about the money. Bob interrupted. and something in his voice told me he meant it. Or maybe it is, partly. But mostly, Maggie, I want to be the kind of man Mother thought I could be. I want to be the kind of brother you deserve. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. What are you doing? I asked. Looking up senior care facilities, he said. I figure if I'm going to do this, I might as well start right away. No point in waiting around. As I watched my brother standing there in that parking lot, looking more determined and focused than I'd seen him in years, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Maybe Mother's conditions weren't just about the inheritance after all. Maybe they were about giving Bob a chance to find his way back to the person he used to be, before Sandra and selfishness had led him astray. And maybe, just maybe, Sandra's ugly outburst had actually done us a favor. Because now Bob could see her for who she really was, and more importantly, he could start figuring out who he wanted to be. Come on, I said, putting my hand on his shoulder. Let's go get some coffee and figure out how you're going to make Mother proud. 2 weeks after the will reading, I got a phone call that I never expected to receive. Maggie. Bob's voice sounded different, tired, but somehow lighter than it had been in years. I wanted to let you know that I start my volunteer work at Sunset Manor tomorrow. Sunset Manor was one of the nicest senior care facilities in our city, known for its compassionate staff and beautiful grounds. I was impressed that Bob had chosen such a reputable place rather than looking for the easiest option. That's wonderful, Bob, I said, and I meant it. How are you feeling about it? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Honestly, terrified, he admitted. I keep thinking about all the times I should have been there for Mother, and I'm wondering if I even know how to take care of elderly people. What if I mess this up too? Bob, I said gently, the fact that you're worried about doing it right tells me you're already approaching this differently than you approached things before. Maybe, he said, still sounding uncertain. Listen, Maggie. I was wondering, would you be willing to give me some advice? I know you spent years taking care of Mother, and I feel like I'm starting from scratch. The request surprised me, but it also filled me with something I hadn't felt toward my brother in a long time: pride. Of course, I said. Why don't you come over for dinner tonight and we can talk? That evening, Bob showed up at my door carrying a bouquet of flowers, not expensive roses or anything flashy, just a simple mixed bouquet from the grocery store. But it was the first time he'd brought me flowers in probably 20 years. These are beautiful, I said, genuinely touched by the gesture. I wanted to start practicing, he said with a shy smile. You know, thinking about other people first. We talked over dinner about practical things, how to be patient with elderly people who moved slowly or repeated themselves, how to listen for what they really needed rather than just what they were asking for, how to maintain their dignity even when they needed help with basic tasks. But as the evening went on, our conversation drifted into deeper territory. Maggie, Bob said as we were clearing the dishes, can I ask you something? Were you angry with me? All those years when I wasn't helping with Mother, were you furious that I was leaving everything to you? I considered the question carefully. Yes, I said finally. Sometimes I was. Especially on the really hard days, when Mother was in pain or scared, and I was handling it all alone. But you know what? Most of the time I was more sad than angry. Sad? Sad that you were missing out, I explained. Bob, those last few years with Mother were difficult, but they were also precious. We had conversations we'd never had before. She told me stories about her childhood, about our father, about things that mattered to her. She shared her wisdom and her fears and her hopes for us. You missed all of that. Bob was quiet for a long moment, loading the dishwasher with more care than I'd ever seen him take with household chores. I can't get those years back, he said finally. No, I agreed. But you can make sure you don't miss any more opportunities to really connect with people who matter. The next day, Bob called me after his first shift at Sunset Manor. It was harder than I expected, he said, but not in the way I thought it would be. What do you mean? I thought the hard part would be the physical stuff, helping people walk or eat or whatever. But that wasn't it at all. The hard part was listening to them talk about their families who never visit, or their children who are too busy to call. Maggie, there's a woman there named Dorothy who hasn't had a visitor in 6 months. 6 months. Her son lives 20 minutes away. I could hear the emotion in his voice, and I realized that Bob was starting to see his own behavior reflected in the stories of these neglected elderly residents. How did it make you feel? I asked. Like I wanted to call Dorothy's son and shake him, Bob said. And then I realized, God, Maggie, I was Dorothy's son. I was that person who was too busy, too distracted, too selfish to show up for someone who needed me. Over the following weeks, Bob called me regularly to share stories from his volunteer work. He told me about Harold, who had been a jazz musician in his youth and could still play beautiful piano despite his arthritis. He talked about Agnes, who had been a teacher for 40 years and still corrected his grammar with a twinkle in her eye. He described helping residents write letters to grandchildren they rarely saw, and organizing a weekly game night that had become the most popular activity at the facility. You know what's funny? Bob said during one of our calls. I thought this was supposed to be about me doing community service, paying some kind of debt. But honestly, these people are giving me way more than I'm giving them. How so? They're teaching me things, he said. Patience, for one thing, and gratitude. Do you know that Harold thanks me every single day for helping him with his crossword puzzle? Every day like it's the first time. And Agnes always asks about my day before she tells me about hers. These people have lost their independence, their health, sometimes their memories, but they're still thinking about other people first. It was around this same time that Bob started attending family counseling sessions with me. Our therapist, Dr. Martinez, was a kind woman in her 50s who specialized in family dynamics and grief counseling. The first session was awkward, with both of us sitting stiffly in our chairs, unsure of how to begin. But Dr. Martinez had a way of asking gentle questions that gradually opened up conversations we'd never had before. Bob, she said during our third session, you've mentioned that you feel like you disappointed your mother. Can you tell me more about that? Bob was quiet for a long moment, fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. I think, he said slowly, I spent so many years trying to prove that I didn't need anyone that I forgot how to be needed by someone else. Mother raised us to be independent, to take care of ourselves, but somewhere along the way I confused independence with selfishness. What's the difference? Dr. Martinez asked. Independence means you can handle your own problems, Bob said. Selfishness means you don't care about anyone else's problems. Dr. Martinez turned to me. Maggie, how does it feel to hear Bob say that? It feels like progress, I said honestly. For so long, I felt like Bob didn't understand the impact of his choices on other people. But I can see that he's starting to get it. I'm getting it because of the work I'm doing at Sunset Manor, Bob said. Those residents, they don't have the luxury of being selfish. They have to depend on other people for everything: eating, bathing, getting around. But they still find ways to contribute, to care for each other, to make other people's lives better. It's humbling. By the end of our 6th counseling session, Bob had made significant progress on one of Mother's other conditions. He brought me a handwritten letter, not typed, as Mother had specifically requested, that was 4 pages long and written in his careful cursive handwriting. I don't want you to read it while I'm here, he said, handing me the envelope. It's too personal, and I'm still too embarrassed about some of the things I had to acknowledge. That night, alone in my kitchen with a cup of tea, I opened Bob's letter. The first paragraph made me cry. Dear Maggie, I don't even know how to begin apologizing for the years I stole from you. While you were sacrificing your time, your energy, and your freedom to care for our mother, I was living like a single man with no family responsibilities. I convinced myself that, because you were good at caregiving and seemed to handle it well, it was okay for me to step back and let you handle everything. I was wrong. I was selfish. And I robbed you of years when you should have been living your own life instead of covering for my absence. The letter went on for 3 more pages, detailing specific instances where Bob recognized his failures, missed holidays, skipped visits, times when he'd made excuses rather than showing up. But it wasn't just a catalog of regrets. It was also a recognition of what my sacrifices had meant. You gave Mother the gift of dignity in her final years, he wrote. You made sure she never felt abandoned or forgotten. You were her companion when she was lonely, her advocate when she was scared, and her comfort when she was in pain. You did all of this not because it was easy, but because it was right. I will spend the rest of my life trying to become the kind of person who chooses to do what's right instead of what's convenient. The letter ended with a promise. I can't undo the past, but I can promise you that from now on, you will never have to carry family burdens alone. I want to be the brother you deserve, the brother Mother raised me to be. I want to earn your forgiveness and your respect, but most importantly, I want to be someone you can count on. When I finished reading, I sat in my quiet kitchen and cried not tears of sadness, but tears of relief and hope. The brother I remembered from our childhood, the one who used to defend me from neighborhood bullies and share his Halloween candy with me, was still in there somewhere. He'd just been buried under years of selfishness and poor choices. 3 months into his volunteer work, Bob called me with excitement in his voice. "Maggie, you'll never believe what happened today. Dorothy, remember I told you about Dorothy, whose son never visits? Well, today he showed up. Out of nowhere!" Apparently, his daughter had been after him for months to visit his mother, and he finally listened. "That's wonderful, Bob. But here's the crazy part," Bob continued. "Dorothy introduced me to her son as my friend Bob, who reads to me every week. Not as a volunteer, not as someone doing community service, as her friend. And you know what? That's exactly what I am. These people aren't my obligation anymore, Maggie. They're my friends." "How does that feel?" I asked. "Like I finally understand what Mother was trying to teach me," Bob said. "It's not about keeping score or doing your duty or meeting expectations. It's about showing up for people because you care about them. It's about being present in someone's life, not because you have to be, but because you want to be." As I hung up the phone that day, I realized that Bob had already accomplished something more valuable than earning his inheritance. He had found his way back to being the man our mother had always believed he could be. And in the process, he had given me back the brother I thought I'd lost forever. 4 months into Bob's volunteer work at Sunset Manor, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about my brother's transformation. "Maggie." Bob's voice was shaky, and I could tell he'd been crying. "I need to talk to you. Something happened at the facility today, and I don't know what to do." "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, I'm not hurt," he said. "But Harold is. Harold's hurt, and it's my fault." Harold was the jazz musician Bob had grown so fond of, the elderly man with arthritis who still played piano despite his pain. Bob had mentioned him in nearly every conversation we'd had about his volunteer work. "Bob, slow down," I said. "Tell me what happened." "I was helping Harold get to the piano room for his afternoon practice," Bob explained, his words tumbling over each other. "He was having a bad day with his arthritis. So I offered to walk with him, but I was distracted. I was thinking about something Dorothy had said earlier, and I wasn't paying close enough attention. Harold stumbled, and I didn't catch him in time. He fell, Maggie. He broke his wrist." I could hear the guilt and self-recrimination in my brother's voice. "Bob, accidents happen. The staff at Sunset Manor knows that. I'm sure they don't blame you. That's not the point," Bob interrupted. "Harold trusted me to help him, and I let him down. Just like I let Mother down all those years. Just like I let you down. What if I can't change? What if I'm just destined to disappoint everyone who depends on me?" This was a side of Bob I hadn't seen since our childhood, the vulnerable, frightened little boy who used to come to me when he'd made a mistake and was afraid of getting in trouble. But now the stakes felt so much higher. "Where are you right now?" I asked. "In my car. Outside the facility. I couldn't face going home to that empty apartment. Sandra took most of the furniture when she moved out, and it just feels like a monument to all my poor choices." "Come over here," I said without hesitation. "Right now. We'll figure this out together." When Bob arrived at my house 20 minutes later, he looked like he'd aged 5 years in the span of an afternoon. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair was disheveled, and his eyes were red from crying. "Tell me everything that happened," I said, settling him on the couch with a cup of coffee. The story that emerged was actually quite different from Bob's initial guilt-ridden version. Harold had been having an unusually difficult day with his arthritis, but had insisted on going to the piano room because he'd promised another resident, Agnes, that he would play her favorite song. Bob had offered to walk with him, as he'd done dozens of times before. But this time, Harold had stumbled over a small crack in the hallway floor that they'd both navigated safely many times before. "The nurse said it was just one of those things," Bob admitted reluctantly. "She said Harold's balance has been getting worse lately, and falls are unfortunately common with residents his age. She even thanked me for being there to break his fall, because it could have been much worse if he'd fallen completely." "So Harold's injury wasn't actually your fault," I said gently. "But I should have been more careful," Bob insisted. "I should have been watching more closely, if I hadn't been thinking about other things." "Bob," I interrupted, "do you remember when Mother fell in her bathroom 3 years ago and broke her hip?" He looked up at me, confused by the change of subject. Of course I remember. That's when she had to use the walker. I was in the house when it happened, I said. I was in the kitchen, maybe 20 feet away. I heard the crash and ran to help her. But it was too late. She'd already fallen. Do you think that was my fault? What? No, of course not. You couldn't have prevented that. Mother was unsteady on her feet, and bathroom floors are slippery. Exactly, I said. Sometimes accidents happen, even when people who care are doing their best to prevent them. The question isn't whether you're perfect, Bob. The question is whether you're there when people need you. Bob was quiet for a long moment, processing what I'd said. The thing is, he said finally, when Harold fell, my first instinct wasn't to make excuses or blame someone else or find a way to avoid responsibility. My first instinct was to make sure he was okay and get him help. And then I felt terrible because I thought I'd failed him. And how is that different from how you would have reacted before? I asked. Bob considered this. Before? I probably would have found a way to make it someone else's problem. I would have called for the staff and then disappeared before anyone could ask me questions about what happened. But you didn't do that this time? No, he said, sounding surprised by his own realization. I stayed with Harold until the paramedics came. I held his good hand while they X-rayed his wrist. I called his daughter to let her know what had happened. And I've already arranged to visit him in the hospital tomorrow. Bob, I said gently, that sounds like exactly what a caring person would do. That sounds like what Mother would have wanted you to do. Over the next few weeks, Bob's relationship with Harold actually grew stronger. Harold, it turned out, was more concerned about Bob's guilt than he was about his own injury. That young man keeps apologizing to me, Harold told me when I went with Bob to visit him in the hospital. I keep telling him that these old bones have been falling down since before he was born, but he won't hear it. Harold, Bob said. I just feel like I should have been more careful. Son, Harold replied, patting Bob's shoulder with his good hand, in my 92 years free, I've learned that the people who worry about whether they're doing enough caring are usually the ones who are doing plenty. It's the ones who don't worry that you have to watch out for. The incident with Harold became a turning point for Bob in ways I hadn't expected. He started approaching his volunteer work with even more dedication, but also with more confidence. He realized that caring about people meant accepting that you couldn't protect them from everything, but you could make sure they didn't face difficulties alone. I used to think that being responsible for someone meant never letting anything bad happen to them. Bob told me during one of our counseling sessions with Dr. Martinez. But that's impossible. Being responsible for someone really means being there for them when bad things happen anyway. Dr. Martinez nodded approvingly. That's a very mature insight, Bob. How do you think your mother would have responded to Harold's accident? She would have done exactly what Bob did, I said before he could answer. She would have stayed with Harold, made sure he got help, and then worried herself sick about whether she could have prevented it. The difference is, Bob added, Mother would have forgiven herself faster than I'm forgiving myself. She understood that loving someone doesn't make you responsible for every bad thing that happens to them. Around this same time, Bob received an unexpected phone call that brought some of his old challenges back to the surface. Wes, who called me today, he said when he came over for our weekly dinner. Sandra. I felt my stomach clench. What did she want? To tell me that she's engaged, Bob said with a wry smile. Apparently, she met someone new, a guy who owns a chain of restaurants. She wanted to let me know that she's moved on to bigger and better things. How did that make you feel? Honestly, relieved, Bob said. And a little sad, but not for the reasons you might think. I'm sad that I wasted 3 years with someone who saw me as a meal ticket instead of a person. But mostly, I'm grateful that mothers will force me to see Sandra's true character before I made an even bigger mistake. Like what? Like marrying her? Bob said quietly. I was actually thinking about proposing, right before Mother died. I had been saving up for a ring. Free. Can you imagine what my life would look like right now if I'd married someone who only cared about what I could give her financially? The thought made both of us shudder. You know what's funny? Bob continued. Sandra spent the whole phone call trying to make me jealous, talking about how successful her new fiancé is, how much money he has, how he's already bought her a house. But all I could think about was Dorothy at Sunset Manor, who's been married to the same man for 68 years, and how she lights up every time he visits, Even though he has dementia and sometimes doesn't remember who she is. That's real love, I agreed. That's the kind of love I want, Bob said. Someone who would stick with me even if I lost everything. Someone who cares more about who I am than what I have. Mother tried to protect me from making a huge mistake, and I'm finally smart enough to appreciate it. As Bob approached the 6-month mark of his volunteer work, something unexpected happened. The director of Sunset Manor, Mrs. Patterson, asked to speak with him privately. She offered me a job. Bob told me that evening, his voice full of amazement. A real job, working in their activities department. She said I have a natural gift for connecting with the residents, and they'd like me to consider making this more than just volunteer work. Bob, that's incredible! What did you tell her? I told her I need to think about it, he said. It would mean leaving my job at the insurance company, taking a significant pay cut. But Maggie, I've never been happier than I've been these past few months. I wake up every morning excited to go to Sunset Manor. I care about these people, and they care about me. What's holding you back? Fear, I guess, Bob admitted. Fear that I'm not really cut out for this kind of work long term. Fear that I'll disappoint people who are counting on me. Fear that this is just a phase and I'll go back to being selfish and unreliable. Bob, I said 6 months ago, you were dating a woman who saw you as an ATM, and you hadn't visited our mother in weeks. Today, you're considering dedicating your career to caring for elderly people, and you're worried about whether you're good enough at putting other people first. Don't you think that's evidence that you really have changed? Bob looked at me for a long moment, and then he smiled, a real, genuine smile that reminded me of the brother I'd grown up with. You know what? He said. I think I want to take the job. Even if Mother's inheritance conditions are met. Even if I get that money, I want to do this work because it matters to me. Have you thought about what you'll do with the inheritance if you do meet all the conditions? Actually, yes, Bob said. I want to set up a fund for Sunset Manor to help residents who can't afford to have family members visit regularly. Maybe hire someone to coordinate family outreach, or provide transportation for relatives who want to visit but don't have cars. I want to use that money to make sure no resident ever feels as forgotten as Dorothy did when I first met her. As I watched my brother talk about his plans that were entirely focused on helping other people, rather than enriching himself, I realized that Mother's conditions had accomplished something even more valuable than she'd probably hoped for. They hadn't just made Bob a better son and brother. They had helped him discover who he really wanted to be. 6 months to the day after Mother's will reading, Bob and I sat in Mr. Henderson's office once again. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. There was no tension, no greed, no false expectations. Just two siblings who had found their way back to each other through grief, growth, and genuine change. Well, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Henderson said, reviewing the documents spread across his desk. It appears you've met all the conditions your mother set forth in her will. Bob had completed his 6 months of volunteer work at Sunset Manor, though he was continuing as a paid employee. We had finished our 12 weeks of family counseling, which had evolved into regular weekly dinners and genuine friendship. His heartfelt letter of apology was safely tucked away in my jewelry box, next to Mother's wedding ring, and his relationship with Sandra had ended dramatically in that parking lot months ago. I have verification from Sunset Manor that you've contributed well over the required 20 hours per week, Mr. Henderson continued. In fact, they've written quite a glowing letter about your dedication and the positive impact you've had on their residents. And Dr. Martinez has provided documentation that you and your sister have successfully completed your counseling sessions, he added, nodding toward me. She noted that you've made remarkable progress in rebuilding trust and communication. Bob shifted in his chair, looking nervous despite having met all the requirements. Mr. Henderson, before we go any further, I need to tell you something. I don't want the money. Both the lawyer and I stared at him in shock. I beg your pardon, Mr. Henderson said. The $300,000, Bob explained. I don't want it. Or rather, I don't want it for myself. I want it to go to Sunset Manor to establish the fund I told Maggie about. A fund to help residents maintain connections with their families. Mr. Henderson frowned. Mr. Thompson, your mother's will doesn't provide for that option. The money is either yours if you meet the conditions, or it goes to your sister if you don't. Then I want to give it to Maggie, Bob said firmly. She can establish the fund if she wants to, or she can keep it. But I've learned something over these past 6 months. The money was never the point. The conditions were the point. They were Mother's way of helping me become someone worth inheriting from. I felt tears starting in my eyes. Bob, you don't have to do this. You earned that money. No, Maggie, he said, turning to face me. I earned something much more valuable than money. I earned back my self-respect. I earned the ability to look at myself in the mirror and like the person I see. I earned the right to call myself Mother's son without feeling ashamed. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat. If I may, Mr. Thompson. There's something else your mother included in her will that I haven't shared yet. She suspected you might have this reaction. He pulled out another document from his file. Your mother wrote what she called a supplemental provision, to be read only if you successfully completed all her conditions. She said, and I quote, "If Robert has truly changed, if he has learned the lessons I hope to teach him, then he will no longer be motivated primarily by financial gain. If this proves to be the case, I want him to know that the greatest inheritance I can give him is not money, but the knowledge that he has become the man I always knew he could be." Bob was crying now, openly and without shame. Mr. Henderson continued reading, "However, I also know that financial security can provide opportunities to do good in the world. Therefore, if Robert wishes to refuse his inheritance for personal use, I hereby authorize him to direct those funds toward any charitable cause he deems worthy, with the understanding that this decision itself proves his transformation is complete." She knew? Bob whispered. She knew I would change, and she knew that once I changed, I wouldn't want the money for selfish reasons. Your mother was a very wise woman, Mr. Henderson said gently. She understood that the best way to change someone's character is to give them opportunities to discover their own capacity for goodness. Bob wiped his eyes and looked at me. Maggie, would you be willing to help me set up that fund for Sunset Manor? I think Mother would like the idea of her money being used to keep families together instead of tearing them apart. Of course, I said, reaching over to squeeze his hand. We'll do it together. As we left the lawyer's office that day, I couldn't help but think about how different this felt from our first visit. 6 months ago, we'd been strangers who happened to share DNA. Today we were truly siblings again. You know, I said as we walked to our cars, I think Mother got exactly what she wanted from that will. What do you mean? She wanted both her children to be taken care of? I explained. She left me financial security because she knew I'd been sacrificing for others and deserved to have my needs met. But she left you something even more valuable. She gave you a path back to being the person she raised you to be. Bob stopped walking and looked at me seriously. Maggie, can I ask you something? Do you forgive me? Really, truly forgive me for all those years when I let you carry everything alone? I thought about his question carefully. 6 months ago, I would have said I forgave him because that's what Mother would have wanted me to say. But now I could answer honestly. Yes, I said. I forgive you completely. But more than that, I'm proud of you. I'm proud of the work you've done, the changes you've made, and the man you've become. Even though it took Mother's death to make me wake up, Bob, I said gently, sometimes it takes a crisis to show us who we really are. What matters isn't that you needed a push to change. What matters is that when you got that push, you chose to become better instead of becoming bitter. The fund we established at Sunset Manor became Bob's passion project. We named it the Eleanor Thompson Family Connection Fund, and it provided transportation for family members to visit residents, sponsored family events at the facility, and even helped some residents reconnect with relatives they'd lost touch with over the years. The first family reunion the fund sponsored was for Dorothy, the woman who'd had no visitors for 6 months when Bob first met her. It turned out she had a granddaughter living in another state who desperately wanted to visit, but couldn't afford the travel expenses. The fund paid for the granddaughter's plane ticket, and Bob got to witness their emotional reunion, seeing Dorothy hug her granddaughter for the first time in 3 years. Bob told me that evening was worth more than any inheritance could ever be. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came 3 months later, during our weekly family dinner. Bob had started cooking these meals himself, insisting that if we were going to have regular family time, he should contribute more than just his appetite. I have something for you, he said, disappearing into the kitchen and returning with a small wrapped box. Inside was a simple silver locket engraved with the words, Sisters of the Heart. It's not expensive, Bob said quickly. But I saw it and thought of you. You know, because even though we're siblings, You've been more like a sister to me these past few months. The kind of sister who sticks with you even when you don't deserve it. I opened the locket and found 2 tiny pictures inside, one of Mother from her younger days, and one of Bob and me as children, arms around each other, toothed grins shining with the innocent happiness of childhood. Where did you find this picture? I asked, my voice thick with emotion. I found it in Mother's jewelry box when I was helping you clean out her house, Bob said. She had it framed on her nightstand. But I thought it belonged with you now. As I fastened the locket around my neck, I realized that this was what Mother had really wanted to leave us, not money or property, but each other. She'd known that her death would either drive us apart permanently or bring us closer together than we'd been since childhood. Her will had been designed to ensure it was the latter. Bob, I said, I have something for you too. I went to my purse and pulled out a set of keys. What are these? Keys to Mother's house? I said. I know the will left it to me. But I've been thinking about it a lot. That house is too big for one person, and it has too many memories to sit empty. I'd like you to move in if you want to. We could share it, the way we probably should have been sharing the responsibility for Mother all along. Bob stared at the keys in his palm. Are you serious? Completely serious? I said. But there are conditions. He looked up at me with alarm, and then we both started laughing. What conditions? He asked. You have to help me finish going through Mother's things. You have to help me maintain the garden she loved so much. And you have to promise me that if either of us ever starts taking the other for granted again, we'll speak up about it instead of letting resentment build. Deal, Bob said without hesitation. But I have a condition too. What's that? Sunday dinners at the house, every week, no exceptions. And we take turns cooking. Even when we're old and gray and probably driving each other crazy. Especially then, Bob said. We're family, Maggie, real family. And family shows up for each other, no matter what. As I hugged my brother that night, feeling the weight of Mother's locket against my chest and the warmth of genuine reconciliation in my heart, I knew that Eleanor Thompson's final wishes had been fulfilled in ways that went far beyond anything a legal document could require. She had wanted her children to understand the value of family, sacrifice, and genuine love. She had wanted us to take care of each other the way she had taken care of us. And through her wisdom, her patience, and her carefully crafted conditions, she had given us the greatest inheritance of all. She had given us back to each other. 1 year after Mother's will reading, Bob and I stood in the garden behind her house, our house now, preparing for a celebration that would have made Eleanor Thompson prouder than any inheritance distribution ever could. The Eleanor Thompson Family Connection Fund had grown beyond our wildest expectations. Word had spread throughout the community about the program, and donations had poured in from families who understood the importance of staying connected across generations. Local businesses had contributed, service clubs had adopted us as their charity of choice, and even the mayor had recognized our work with a community service award. Maggie, can you believe this? Bob said, surveying the dozen picnic tables we'd set up in Mother's backyard when we planned this first annual reunion. I thought maybe 20 people would show up. I looked around at the bustling preparations and smiled. There were at least 60 people expected, residents from Sunset Manor and their families, staff members who had become like family to Bob, neighbors who had known and loved Mother for decades, and friends we'd both made through our volunteer work and community involvement. Harold was coming, of course, his wrist fully healed and his spirit as vibrant as ever. He'd insisted on bringing his portable keyboard so he could perform some of the jazz standards that had become his signature at Sunset Manor. Dorothy would be there with her granddaughter, who had since moved closer to town so she could visit more regularly. Agnes was coming with her son, who had started visiting weekly after being inspired by Bob's example of family dedication. You know what I think Mother would love most about today? I said to Bob as we hung streamers from the old oak tree where she used to sit and read. What's that? That we're using her house the way it was meant to be used? I said. When we were kids, this backyard was always full of people. Birthday parties, neighborhood barbecues, holiday gatherings. After Dad died, Mother made sure this place stayed a center for community and connection. We're continuing that tradition. Bob smiled, tying off a balloon. I was thinking the same thing. You know, living here this past year has helped me understand Mother better. I found some of her old journals when we were cleaning out the attic, and she wrote a lot about how important it was to her that this house be a place where people felt welcome and cared for. What else did she write about? Bob's expression grew thoughtful. A lot about us, actually. About her hopes for our futures, her worries about our relationship, her dreams for what we could become if we learned to support each other. She wrote about watching me drift away from the family and wondering how to bring me back without pushing me further away. She found a way, I said softly. She did, Bob agreed. But Maggie. One of the things that struck me most in her journals was how much she wrote about forgiveness. Not just forgiving other people, but forgiving herself for the mistakes she made as a parent. What mistakes? Mother was wonderful. She didn't think so, Bob said. She blamed herself for Dad's death somehow, even though it was just a heart attack. She worried that she'd been too lenient with me, too strict with you. She second-guessed every major decision she made. But you know what she wrote in one of her last entries? I shook my head, curious. She wrote, I've realized that the point of being a parent isn't to be perfect. It's to love your children enough to help them become better people than you are. I may have made mistakes, but if Maggie and Robert can learn from those mistakes and love each other better than I loved myself, then I will have succeeded. Tears filled my eyes as I thought about Mother's words. Even in her final months, when she was creating the conditions for Bob's inheritance, she hadn't been thinking about punishment or revenge. She'd been thinking about love and growth and the possibility of redemption. She succeeded, I said firmly. Look at us, Bob. Look at what we've built together. Look at all the lives that have been touched because she was wise enough to see what we could become. The party that afternoon exceeded all our expectations. Harold's jazz performance had everyone clapping and singing along, including several Sunset Manor residents who rarely spoke but seemed to come alive when the music started. Dorothy's granddaughter gave a tearful speech about how the Family Connection Fund had given her back her grandmother. Agnes presented Bob with a handmade quilt featuring squares created by all the residents he'd worked with over the past year. But the moment that touched me most came when Mrs. Patterson, the director of Sunset Manor, asked to address the crowd. A year ago, she said, her voice carrying across the garden, a man named Bob Thompson walked into our facility to fulfill what he thought was a community service requirement. He was sullen, resentful, and frankly, I wasn't sure he'd last a week. Bob blushed as laughter rippled through the crowd. But I watched this man transform before our eyes, Mrs. Patterson continued. I watched him discover that caring for elderly people wasn't a chore to be endured, but a privilege to be embraced. I watched him form genuine friendships with our residents, advocate for their needs, and bring joy into their daily lives in ways that went far beyond any job description. She paused to look directly at Bob. Bob Thompson didn't just meet his volunteer requirements. He exceeded them in every possible way. He brought innovation to our activities program, compassion to our daily operations, and most importantly, he brought respect and dignity to every interaction with our residents. Today, Bob isn't just an employee at Sunset Manor, he's family. The applause was thunderous, but Mrs. Patterson held up her hand to continue. But the real testament to Bob's character isn't what he's done for our facility. It's what he's inspired others to do. Since the Eleanor Thompson Family Connection Fund was established, we've seen a 40% increase in family visits to our residents. We've reconnected 12 residents with family members they'd lost touch with. We've provided transportation for over 100 family visits. And most importantly, we've created a model that other facilities around the state are now copying. She gestured toward a banner that read, Eleanor's Legacy Connecting Hearts, Honoring Family. Eleanor Thompson raised a son who lost his way for a while, Mrs. Patterson said, but she also raised a son who had the courage to find his way back. And in doing so, he's helped dozens of other families find their way back to each other too. As the party continued into the evening, I found myself sitting on the porch swing where Mother used to spend her afternoons, watching Bob interact with the diverse group of people who had become his chosen family. He was helping Harold back to his chair, laughing with Dorothy's granddaughter about something, checking to make sure Agnes had enough to eat. You're thinking about her, aren't you? Said a voice beside me. I looked up to see Dr. Martinez, who had become not just our family counselor but a genuine friend. How could I not be? I replied. This whole scene, Bob surrounded by people who care about him, using his gifts to help others, building the kind of community Mother always valued, it's exactly what she dreamed of for him. And for you too, Dr. Martinez pointed out. Maggie, when I first met you and Bob, you were carrying the weight of years of resentment and responsibility. You'd given so much of yourself to caring for others that you'd almost forgotten how to let others care for you. Look at you now. She was right. Over the past year, as Bob and I had rebuilt our relationship and created this new life together, I'd learned how to accept help, how to share burdens, and how to trust that I wasn't alone anymore. I'd started dating again, tentatively, but with genuine hope for companionship. I joined a book club and made new friends my own age. I'd even taken a vacation, something I hadn't done in years. Eleanor's conditions weren't just about changing Bob, Dr. Martinez continued. They were about freeing you too. Freeing you from the role of the sole responsible child, the one who always had to sacrifice for others. She wanted both her children to have balanced, fulfilling lives. As the evening wound down and we helped the elderly residents back to the van that would take them to Sunset Manor, Harold pulled me aside. "Miss Maggie," he said in his gentle, jazz singer voice, "I want you to know something. Your brother talks about you all the time at the facility, but not in the way you might think." "What do you mean?" "He doesn't talk about what you did for your mother, though he's certainly proud of that," Harold explained. "He talks about what you did for him. How you welcomed him back when he'd given you every reason to turn him away. How you helped him become the man he wanted to be. Bob says you saved his life, Miss Maggie, and watching him this past year, I believe that's true. As Bob and I cleaned up the garden together after the last guest had left, he found something that made him stop in his tracks. "Maggie, look at this," he said, holding up a small piece of paper that had blown under one of the picnic tables. It was a note, written in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for bringing my grandson to see me. It was the best day I've had in years. Mrs. Chen." Mrs. Chen was a new resident at Sunset Manor whose family lived in California. The Family Connection Fund had paid for her grandson's flight so he could visit for her birthday. "You know what this means," Bob said, holding up the note. "That we're making a difference. That mother's legacy is going to continue long after we're gone," Bob said. "Every family reunion we sponsor, every grandchild who gets to hug their grandparent, every elderly person who realizes they're not forgotten, it's all because Mother was wise enough to see past our flaws to our potential." As we turned off the lights and locked up the house, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. A year ago, I'd been a lonely woman carrying the entire burden of caring for an aging parent, while my brother pursued a selfish, empty life with a woman who saw him only as a meal ticket. Today, I was part of a true family again, working alongside my brother to honor our mother's memory in ways that touched countless other lives. "Bob," I said as we said goodnight on the front porch, "do you ever wonder what Mother would think of all this?" He smiled, and in the porch light, I could see both the little boy I'd grown up with and the man he'd become. "I think she'd say her will worked exactly the way she planned it," he replied. "She wanted her children to take care of each other and use her legacy to take care of others." Mission accomplished. As I went to bed that night in the house where Mother had raised us, surrounded by photos of the extended family we'd created through our volunteer work and community connections, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since childhood. Eleanor Thompson had given us the greatest inheritance any parent can give their children. She had shown us how to love well, how to forgive deeply, and how to build lives that honor the sacrifices of those who came before us. Her will hadn't just distributed her worldly possessions. It had distributed her wisdom, her values, and her capacity for transforming lives through unconditional love and strategic kindness. And that legacy would continue to grow, touching families we'd never meet, in ways we couldn't even imagine. Sometimes the most powerful inheritances can't be measured in dollars and cents. Sometimes they can only be measured in changed hearts, renewed relationships, and the ripple effects of love that extend far beyond what any legal document could ever require. Eleanor Thompson had smirked with satisfaction from beyond the grave, not because she'd gotten revenge on a selfish son and his gold-digging girlfriend, but because she'd given her children the tools they needed to build lives worthy of the love she'd invested in them. And in the end, that was the greatest gift she could have left us.